The Cold War was ushered in by the use of the world's most powerful weapon at the time, the atomic bomb. This, of course, was soon eclipsed by the hydrogen bomb as the superpowers pursued more plentiful and more efficient tools to end humanity. We've talked a lot about nuclear weapons over the past 7+ years, but the superpowers also pursued other weapons of mass destruction designed to destroy humanity as we know it. In a recent episode, we talked about the US biological weapons program pursued after the Second World War, up to Richard Nixon's unilateral cancellation of those programs. I'm your host David, and today we are going to return to the subject, picking up Tricky Dick where we left off, and talking about what happened next. This is the Cold War. In December 1969, President Richard Nixon announced to the world that the United States would end its biological weapons program. He declared that America would never again develop, produce, stockpile, or use biological agents for offensive purposes. To the public, it sounded like the conclusion of a troubling chapter. But for the scientists, soldiers, and officials who had lived within the classified world of germ warfare, it was only a pause, a moment before the reckoning that would come when their secrets finally reached daylight. The end of the program did not mean disclosure. For several years, the records remained sealed. The facilities at Fort Detrick continued to operate, now rebranded as Centers for Defensive Research. Officially, the United States had renounced its biological arsenal, but unofficially, much of the infrastructure stayed intact. The same scientists who had once developed delivery systems for anthrax and tularemia were now tasked with finding vaccines to protect against them. The language changed, but the expertise remained the same. When the Biological Weapons Convention was signed in 1972, it symbolized a new era of international restraint. Yet the convention's power relied entirely on trust. There were no inspection mechanisms, no verifications, no way to ensure that nations were truly dismantling their programs. The Cold War had simply moved its biological research underground, hidden within the folds of defensive study and public health preparedness. Even so, inside the United States, the silence surrounding the earlier tests was beginning to crack. The first fissure appeared not through espionage or whistleblowing, but through declassification. In the mid-1970s, as the shadow of Watergate exposed the breadth of government secrecy, Congress and the press began demanding transparency across the intelligence and defense communities. The American public, already distrustful after years of Vietnam and political scandal, wanted to know what else had been done in their name. In 1975, the Senate Subcommittee on Health and Scientific Research, chaired by Senator Edward Kennedy, opened an inquiry into the history of biological and chemical testing by the US government. The investigation sought to determine whether the Pentagon and its affiliates had conducted experiments involving human subjects without consent. At first, the military resisted. Officials argued that most of the tests had been harmless simulations. But as more documents were subpoenaed, a pattern began to emerge. Reporters seized on the revelations. One of the first stories to reach the public came from San Francisco. After 26 years of silence, the Army confirmed that, in 1950, the city had been the target of a Navy test involving Serratia marcescens, the same bacteria linked to an unexplained hospital outbreak that had killed Edward Nevin. Local newspapers ran the story under headlines that sounded like science fiction. Army sprayed germs on San Francisco in secret test. For residents who remembered the infections, the confirmation was both vindication and outrage. The Army maintained that the bacteria had been harmless, but the public's trust was harder to repair. Soon, more examples followed. The St. Louis spraying experiments, the New York subway tests, the Project Shad naval trials. Each was revealed piecemeal, often buried within dry testimony or heavily redacted reports. The details were staggering. Between 1949 and 1969, the Army had conducted at least 239 open-air biological and chemical tests, many of them on US soil. Roughly 80 of those tests had been carried out in populated areas. Millions of civilians had been exposed, unknowingly, to substances that officials described as safe simulants. No one could say for certain how many people had been affected. When questioned before Congress, Pentagon representatives insisted that the agents used were harmless and that no evidence existed of resulting illnesses. The phrase "no evidence" appeared again and again in the transcripts, a statement that was technically true since the government had never monitored the exposed population for long-term effects. To test without consent had been questionable enough. To track the consequences would have been to admit guilt. The hearings painted a picture of a bureaucracy that had lost sight of its own moral compass. Each operation had been justified as necessary, each risk minimized, each report classified. By the time senators read the details aloud in public, the Cold War rationale, the fear of Soviet attack, sounded hollow. The people who had been turned into unwitting test subjects were not enemy combatants, but American citizens. The justification that, quote, it was for their protection, no longer carried weight. In 1977, further investigations by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence uncovered additional programs involving both chemical and biological testing. These included CIA projects that intersected with the military's biowarfare efforts, most notoriously the MKUltra program, which had experimented with drugs and psychological manipulation on human subjects without consent. Though MKUltra was not directly tied to biological agents, its exposure underscored a pervasive culture of experimentation and secrecy within the national security apparatus. The parallels were unmistakable, a government willing to test the boundaries of ethics in pursuit of strategic advantage. As the revelations multiplied, the tone of public debate shifted from shock to disillusionment. Editorials questioned how a democratic government could justify using its own citizens as experimental subjects. The answer, when it came, was bureaucratic rather than moral. Officials emphasized that the tests had occurred in a different era, a time of fear, urgency, and scientific uncertainty. The phrase Cold War context became a shield, as if history could excuse the absence of consent. For the families of those affected, such explanations offered little comfort. In San Francisco, Edward Nevin's relatives filed a lawsuit against the US government in 1981 seeking damages for his death. The case was dismissed as the court ruled that the government retained immunity for discretionary military actions and that the plaintiffs had not proven a direct causal link between the bacterial test and Nevin's infection. It was a bitter outcome that confirmed what many suspected, that accountability would remain as elusive as the truth had once been. At Fort Detrick, where much of the program's research had taken place, the atmosphere grew uneasy. Former scientists found themselves the subject of congressional inquiries and press scrutiny. Many defended their work as essential to national security, arguing that they had believed the tests were safe. Others expressed quiet regret. A few admitted that, even at the time, they had questioned the ethics of exposing unsuspecting populations. But the program's compartmentalization had insulated them from responsibility. Each scientist had only seen a fragment of the whole. By the end of the 1970s, the outlines of the secret testing program were visible, but its full scope remained obscured. Key details like the names of specific cities, the identities of participants, and the exact nature of the agents used were still classified. What the public saw was a partial mosaic, enough to provoke outrage, but not enough to satisfy it. The secrecy that had defined the program now served to protect it from complete understanding. The exposure of the biological testing program coincided with a broader reckoning across American science and medicine. The same decade saw public revelations about the Tuskegee syphilis study, in which black men had been deliberately denied treatment for decades. Together, these scandals forced the nation to confront the dark underside of its scientific progress, namely a pattern of experimentation that had treated human subjects as expendable. Out of that reckoning came the modern framework for research ethics, the principle of informed consent, the creation of institutional review boards, and the demand for transparency in all experiments involving human subjects. In this sense, the Cold War's biological tests left a paradoxical legacy. They demonstrated the dangers of secrecy, but also helped inspire the laws that would prevent similar abuses in the future. The United States could no longer claim ignorance of the moral boundaries it had crossed, yet the consequences of those experiments, whether they were physical, psychological, or political, would linger long after the hearings ended. The early 1970s had begun with a presidential promise to end biological weapons. By decade's close, America was learning what that promise had been meant to hide. The secret war at home was finally becoming visible, and its echoes were everywhere, in courtrooms, in laboratories, and in the uneasy trust between citizens and their government. The reckoning had begun. The congressional revelations of the 1970s had opened a door that could no longer be closed. Once the extent of the government's biological testing came to light, another set of questions followed. Questions that could not be answered by classified reports or official apologies. What had been the cost to those who were exposed? What had happened to the soldiers who participated? And how could a nation rebuild trust in the very institutions that had betrayed it? The military, under mounting pressure, began its own internal reviews. Investigators traced the threads of the program back through decades of secrecy, from open-air tests over San Francisco and St. Louis, to the entomological experiments, and finally to the shipboard trials of the 1960s. The deeper they looked, the more they found. Among the most troubling discoveries were the records of Project Shad. That was the naval component of the Pentagon's biological and chemical testing program. Between 1962 and 1973, thousands of sailors had taken part in what they believed were routine readiness exercises. They were told little about the true purpose of the missions. Only decades later would they learn that their ships had been sprayed with bacteria, chemicals, and sometimes live nerve agents. Many of the participants went on to develop chronic illnesses, including respiratory conditions, autoimmune disorders, cancers, and more. They began to suspect that their exposure was to blame. For years, their claims were dismissed. The Department of Defense maintained that the substances used had been non-pathogenic and that safety precautions had been sufficient. But as more veterans came forward, the pattern became impossible to ignore. In 2002, under public and congressional pressure, the Pentagon finally acknowledged the existence of Project Shad and released portions of its documentation. The declassified files confirmed what the veterans had long alleged. They had been the test subjects in a series of biological and chemical warfare simulations, and they had never been told. The revelations prompted a belated attempt at restitution. The Government of Veteran Affairs established a medical surveillance program to provide health assessments for those affected. Yet, even as officials expressed sympathy, they stopped short of admitting liability. The tests, they said, had been conducted in a different time, under different standards. The refrain was familiar. Cold War necessity, not malice, had driven the experiments. But for the men whose health had been compromised, that distinction offered little comfort. While the stories of the Shad veterans drew public sympathy, another aspect of the program resurfaced as a point of moral contrast: Operation Whitecoat. Conducted between 1954 and 1973, this project had enlisted more than 2,000 volunteer soldiers, most of them Seventh-day Adventists, to participate in controlled exposure studies at Fort Detrick. Unlike the civilians of San Francisco or the sailors of Shad, these men had given consent. They were told what would happen, what diseases would be tested, and what treatments would be provided. Many viewed their participation as patriotic duty, a way to serve without carrying weapons. The volunteers were exposed to pathogens like Q fever, tularemia, and Venezuelan equine encephalitis, diseases that incapacitated but rarely caused death. Their symptoms were tracked and their recoveries carefully recorded. The data they provided helped in developing vaccines and antibiotics that later protected both soldiers and civilians. In many ways, Operation Whitecoat embodied the ethical ideal that the rest of the program had neglected. Its participants were informed, protected, and treated with a level of respect that was, frankly, uncommon in Cold War research. Yet, even Operation Whitecoat raised uncomfortable questions. How voluntary could consent truly be within a military hierarchy, where orders and duty shaped daily life? The difference between the informed consent of the Whitecoat volunteers and the unaware exposure of millions of civilians was striking. They both showed the best and worst of Cold War science, its ability for discipline and its tendency for denial. The ethical reckoning of the 1970s went far beyond the military. It transformed the entire landscape of American scientific research. The exposure of the Tuskegee syphilis study in 1972, where black men had been left untreated for decades so researchers could observe the natural progression of the disease, shocked the nation. Combined with the revelations about Cold War testing, it sparked a movement to establish the principles that had long been missing. In 1974, Congress passed the National Research Act, which created the framework for safeguarding human subjects in medical and scientific research. 2 years later, the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research issued what became known as the Belmont Report. Its principles, respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, directly responded to violations from previous decades. Throughout that document, the echoes of Cold War experiments were evident. The Commission's authors recognized that ethics could not rely solely on trust. It required structure, oversight, and law. Within the Department of Defense, similar reforms took place. 1977, Congress barred the use of chemical or biological agents on humans without informed consent and prior notice to Congress. The formerly secret biological testing program had unintentionally become the reason for its own restrictions. Fort Detrick, the center of America's germ warfare effort, was renamed as a biomedical research center. Its scientists now concentrated on vaccine development, disease surveillance, and countermeasures against possible bioterror threats. Publicly, the transformation appeared complete. Internally, the line between defense and offense remained unclear. The United States had abandoned biological weapons, but it had not forsaken biological research. The new focus on biodefense, studying dangerous pathogens to prevent their use, maintained many of the same tools and methods. To the public, this was a comforting distinction. To those familiar with the history, it was a reminder that knowledge itself can never be entirely disarmed. As decades went by, the legacy of the testing programs faded from public memory, but not from the lives of those affected. In St. Louis, community activists kept pushing for investigations into higher cancer rates in neighborhoods that had been sprayed with zinc-cadmium sulfide. Their calls for accountability were met with bureaucratic deflection. The Army pointed to earlier studies, saying that exposure levels had been too low to cause harm. For residents who had lost family members to unexplained illnesses, however, the reassurance sounded hollow. Remember, the issue was never only about the science, it was about consent, dignity, and the right to know. In San Francisco, the story of Operation Sea Spray remained a warning example. Each time new details emerged, it reignited debates about the limits of government power during times of fear. The Cold War had ended, but the same reasons, secrecy, security, necessity, continued to influence modern politics. The anthrax attacks of 2001, traced back to spores made at a US Army lab, served as a stark reminder that the tools built in the name of defense could still be turned into instruments of harm. Public trust, once broken, proved difficult to rebuild. The same government that had assured citizens of safety during the Cold War now asked them to believe in biodefense programs designed to prevent terrorism. For many, the line between protection and experimentation remained blurred. The very phrase, for national security, carried a shadow, a memory of fog banks laced with bacteria and cities treated as test sites. The reckoning that started in the 1970s never truly ended. Each new generation of scientists and policymakers faced the same question: how much secrecy is justified in the name of safety? The history of the biological testing program provides no simple answers. It only showed that fear can make nearly any measure seem acceptable, and that reason, once distorted by secrecy, can turn even efforts to protect into causes of harm. By the turn of the 21st century, the story had come full circle. The same Fort Detrick laboratories that once cultivated anthrax for weapons now housed America's biodefense research against it. The same government that once dispersed harmless bacteria over cities now prepares for the possibility of real attacks. The key difference is transparency, or at least the appearance of it. Today, public health agencies conduct airflow and dispersion studies in subways and stadiums, but they do so openly, announcing the tests in advance and using inert tracer gases instead of bacteria. It's an effort to do ethically what was once done in secret. Even these modern efforts carry the burden of the past. When New Yorkers saw notices about subway airflow studies in 2016, some responded with discomfort. History had shown them that harmless experiments could mean something different. The legacy of distrust itself acts as a kind of contamination, invisible, ongoing, and passed down. The Cold War's biological testing program was a product of its time, but its consequences belong to ours. It forced a nation to confront the tension between security and conscience, between knowledge and responsibility. It revealed how easily good intentions can be corroded by fear and how long it takes for truth to surface once it has been buried beneath secrecy. As the archives opened and the testimonies accumulated, the picture that emerged was not one of villains and victims, but of a system built to rationalize its own excesses. Scientists convinced themselves that they were preventing catastrophe. Military planners convinced themselves that they were protecting freedom. In the end, both were wrong, not because their fears were unfounded, but because their methods had become indistinguishable from the threats they sought to prevent. The history of America's biological testing program is not simply a chronicle of experiments. It's a study in how nations behave when fear becomes policy. The Cold War turned imagination into weaponry and convinced scientists and soldiers alike that every discovery was defensive, every boundary negotiable, and every risk justified. The reckoning that followed revealed that the true cost of secrecy cannot be measured in data or dollars. It is measured in trust. When the story of the open-air tests became part of public memory in the late 20th century, it contributed to a wider discussion about government power and the ethics of science. The same decades that revealed radiation experiments, secret surveillance, and psychological operations also made Americans rethink what it means to be a citizen. The belief that the government always acted in the public's best interest weakened. Instead, a more complex truth emerged, that democracy could also have its own form of authoritarian tendencies, not in ideology, but hidden within bureaucracy. The architects behind the Cold War's biological program didn't see themselves as villains. Most were career scientists, many from respected universities, who believed they were doing a necessary service. Their motivations weren't driven by cruelty or conquest, but by caution. They feared the world they lived in, the threat of Soviet bioweapons, the memory of Japanese atrocities, and the unpredictability of nuclear standoffs. Yet, in preparing for potential enemies, they turned inward, transforming their own population into a testing ground. By the 1980s, as the Cold War entered its final decade, the biological program had become a cautionary tale within the military establishment. New generations of officers studied it as a lesson in excess, how unchecked secrecy erodes credibility, and how moral compromise can outlast strategic gain. But outside official circles, the memory of the experiments drifted into the margins, cited in documentaries, conspiracy theories, and local legends. The distance between documented truth and speculative paranoia narrowed. Where secrecy creates a vacuum, imagination inevitably fills it. That vacuum still exists today. During moments of crisis, outbreaks, pandemics, bioterror scares, the same questions come up again. Can the government be trusted? Are experiments still happening in secret? The fact that such doubts remain is itself a legacy of the Cold War. Every reassurance now competes with the memory of earlier reassurances that turned out to be false. The legacy of exposure is not just biological, it's psychological. The irony, of course, is that the biological testing program began with good intentions. Its architects sought to protect the nation from a weapon so insidious that it couldn't be seen. They succeeded in understanding how such weapons might work, but not in understanding what that knowledge would do in the society that created it. Once the moral boundary had been crossed, once a city could be treated as an experiment, the idea of consent became secondary to the idea of control. In the decades since, the lines between public health, defense, and intelligence have blurred even more. The rise of biosecurity after September 11 rekindled old fears under new titles. Labs built to study pathogens operated with layers of classification that mirror the secrecy of Fort Detrick. Each new crisis requires preparedness. Each new effort risks echoing the past. History may not repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes, and the rhyme of the Cold War's biological testing is heard whenever secrecy is justified as necessary. There is, however, another legacy, quieter but equally lasting. The scientists who followed the Cold War inherited both the knowledge and the caution of those before them. The frameworks of bioethics, the culture of transparency, and the emphasis on informed consent all trace back to the mistakes of that hidden era. The same laboratories that once dispersed bacteria over cities now publish environmental impact statements. The same agencies that once denied their tests now hold press conferences. The change is imperfect, but it is genuine. The reckoning that started in congressional hearings never brought a clear resolution. Instead, it changed the moral outlook of American science. It prompted a debate about accountability, about whether secrecy can ever blend with democracy. That debate remains unresolved. Each time new evidence appears from the archives, it highlights the same uncomfortable truth that the line between protection and violation is much thinner than most societies want to admit. The Cold War's biological experiments show us that progress isn't a straight path. It swings like a pendulum, moving between discovery and denial, between curiosity and fear. In the 1940s, scientists at Fort Detrick thought they were securing the future. In doing so, they helped shape the moral questions that still trouble us today. The germ clouds that once drifted unseen over cities have long since vanished, but their shadowy remains in the caution of policymakers, in the skepticism of citizens, and in the quiet considerations of every new experiment that asks whether the end ever justifies the means. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which is struggling with the ethical quandaries of decades of secret testing on all the other bell buttons which are now suffering from conditions like ants in the pants, skin failure, and bonus eruptus. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is The Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.